but it's the NRC testimony of the experts confronting the NRC on the restart plan. And one of the men who speaks is a man named David Freeman. He was the CEO of the Tennessee Valley Authority. They have several nuclear power plants. Sacramento Municipal Utilities District that shut down, Rancho Seco, the New York Power Authority, and LA Department of Water and Power. He gets up there and he speaks and he says, this is absolutely insane what you guys are talking about doing.
Wow.
And he goes on, he speaks this a few times, but if you listen to him, you realize that this is really a life and death matter. It's not a low probability event that they're flirting with here. And he's saying you should absolutely shut this thing down, decommission it. This thing is too badly damaged. So if you hear that and you hear some of the other experts that pipe in on this discussion, I think you'll realize that it's a much more serious problem than people are perceiving it to be, because Edison's very effective at confusing the public with messages that it's only a pinhole leak in one tube. There's thousands of tubes that have worn down to the point where they could rupture. And the NRC says it's part of the way they do risk analysis. They say they will never consider more than one tube bursting. And all the independent experts say when one tube bursts under that kind of pressure, you get a cascading effect of tubes, in which case they say these main steam lines can't handle all this sudden pressure. So you get a big steam line break. And there was a engineer in the power plant that runs the reactor. He says what happens when that steam line breaks, he says it's like a massive explosion. It's like a mortar going off inside of that building. It'll kill people. There won't be anybody to shut this thing off. There's no way to contain it. He says it just becomes, it escalates. The pinhole escalates to a tube break, to a cascading tube break, to a main steam line break, and he describes this whole scenario. And he says you've got just a few months operating this thing until you get one of those things breaking. And they're not going to run it at 70%. 70% is not about the reactor. It's about how much steam they're running through the turbines.
The pressure.
They're going to run that thing at 100%. Those reactors are either on or they're off. So 70% is really
Where's the 70%
misleading.
come in?
Edison was saying if we run this thing at 70% and run less,
70% of what?
they were saying running 70% of steam
Capacity.
through the steam generators, that they're not going to have this
Pressure.
fluid elastic instability that's causing these tubes to wear against each other. The experts, the best testimony came from an expert in Canada, and he models this thing called fluid elastic instability. And he says, when you change that flow through there, he says, we have no way of knowing what's going to happen. And he said, it's a guess. And that's what Edison's saying. They said, well, nobody really knows what's going to happen. So rather than losing the plant to decommission, we're going to fire it up and see what happens. It doesn't fire up at half throttle. It fires up at, the reactors are going full bore. They got two damaged reactors, which are the primary cooling loop for the reactor. We just had a meeting with the head of San Diego County's, it's called the Office of Emergency Services, a man named Tom Amabile. That was last week. I met with him, and I said, Tom, where do you get your information from about what a disaster would be at San Onofre? He says, from Edison, through the IPC. It's called the Interjurisdictional Planning Committee. And I said, well, what have they told you? He said, well, we've got an area that's only so big that we have to look at. And he says, if there's a radioactive plume, we know that we could wash off the produce and still eat it. I said, Tom, you've been really grossly misinformed. I said, we got 44% of the children around Fukushima have precancerous thyroids right now. We've got contaminated land that's larger than Orange, Los Angeles, and San Diego counties combined. I said, we've got whole towns abandoned in Japan. We've got people still homeless after 2 years. I go, that plant was remote. It was in a remote rural area. This thing's in the middle of 5 counties. I said, are you even prepared? So we brought in this woman. She was trained by Homeland Security. She's an RN. And she sat in this meeting with us, and she said, we don't even know how to decontaminate an ambulance. She said, you need to look at your plans. She said, we can't decontaminate an ambulance. We can't shelter in place at a football stadium. We're having a football game. It's the schools. We can't shelter in place people on the freeways. She says, you can't shelter in place in your car. She says, nobody realizes what this thing could be. And she said, I went public with all this information and I lost my job. So he's listening, and he wound up listening for, I think, 2 hours and 20 minutes. It was a 30-minute meeting. He listened for 2 hours and 20 minutes. I think it was recorded. They had one of those cameras that records meetings in this room. It was at the county building in there. This emergency services headquarters is up on these big shock absorbers. The whole building has no glass in it. It's a really wild thing. It's the command center for all of San Diego County for a severe.
On the way to the airport.
It's off of Claremont, Claremont Boulevard by.
Ruffner.
Oh, I'm thinking of doing.
Ruffin, yeah. So, anyways, he's the head planner, and David, I would say that most of the people in this group that I'm working with know more than he does about nuclear disasters.
Pretty sad.
So, what I see is that not only is this thing flirting with a disaster, but the man who's in charge of keeping us all safe if it does happen has no idea what he's talking about.
It's because everybody's relied on the utility companies to get it right.
To give the information to the emergency responders. I asked him if he knew what a fuel flea was. He said no. I said, you just have to inhale a fuel flea, just one fuel flea. When you have a disaster, it releases trillions of fuel fleas into the wind.
How do you sleep at night?
What's a fuel flea? What's a fuel flea?
A fuel flea is when the zirconium cladding on the fuel rod assemblies are exposed to air, they burn. And when they burn, they release the fuel inside. And the fuel comes out, it burns with it, and it releases these tiny parts. It's, subscopic particles that float in the air, and they're statically charged. There's 2 cases where fuel fleas killed people at San Onofre, and Edison fought them in really heated legal battles. They brought in just an army of experts to fight. One of them was an NRC inspector, a woman named Tang. Her last name is Tang. And the other one was an employee who brought a fuel flea home on his work smock, and the wife apparently shook it out in the laundry and inhaled it, and it killed her. Killed her within a short period of time too, a year or two. It wasn't 20 or 30 or 40 years like they say. These little alpha emitters are very powerful at a short wavelength. So when you inhale them, it's a rare form of cancer, and it's very aggressive.
What's the element that's is it plutonium?
It's uranium.
I know
it's part of the
plutonium is nasty stuff.
Plutonium's nasty too. So when you have an accident, this stuff gets released into the environment. They're called hot particles or fuel fleas. And I asked him, I said, do you know what a hot particle fuel flea is? He said, no. I said, how can this guy be the man who's going to be? So anyways, this RN says when you shelter in place, you need to tape off all the windows at the school, all the doors, tape off all the ventilation systems to the outside, and you need to really isolate yourself inside of buildings. She said, nobody here knows about that. He didn't know about it. So I'm listening to all this, and I'm thinking to myself, I know too much information, right? This is too much information, stuff I don't want to know, really. So what do you do with it? What do you do with this information? You're walking around with this stuff, you realize the 2 Japanese families that just spoke at the Capistrano Unified School District, 2 husband and wives, went up and they said, we never thought it would happen in Japan. They warned us. They told us in Japan, TEPCO and the other utilities said it would never happen. And we believed them. We said it would never happen. They said, now we're dealing with it. And they said the shock, the political chaos, the economic impacts, all these things. He said, we never thought it would happen to us. And that's what the warning was to Capistrano Unified School District. But while we were there was a whole army of Edison's attorneys and PR people who had gotten to the school board before we got there. They'd been lobbying them for the past month. The school board voted 5-2 in favor of Edison. All they had to do was just sign a resolution saying Edison should go through a transparent hearing. And they said, we can't do that. We just can't do that. We need the power. And I said, how can that be? How can it be that Edison is able to get to these people that are in charge of 56 schools and 32,000 children. No, I'm sorry, 53,000 children and 56 schools. and vote down
Yeah.
the safety of the kids. David, I need to figure out, my strategy was, I've got 2 months, I'm just one person. I just started putting feelers out to Japan. Does anybody have connections to the former prime minister? And I got an email back, yes, we do. I said, would he be interested in coming out here to speak? I have direct contacts with the former NRC chairman who was ousted from his post because he was pursuing